Welcome, Vince, back to the show. You are an award-winning journalist. That's what it says on your
Yes.
bio.
Yeah.
um, and a former reporter for some, really amazing, or well-known, I should say, news outlets such as the Financial Times. You're also with the LA Times, and you talk a lot about that in the book. And I can ask you some questions about it. But I think folks might know you from this podcast, from your previous interview and book on the Jakarta method. So welcome to the Red Nation podcast, or welcome back, I should say.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me back, and thanks for having me 3 years ago. It was like a big honor then. And
3 years ago?
yeah, the Jakarta Method came out in May 2020, which I remember quite distinctly because I was trapped in Sao Paulo with the pandemic, just like ravaging all of Brazil under Bolsonaro. So I'll never really forget those couple of months. But yeah, I was really grateful to have you let me talk about it back then and to be back now.
Yeah, and this is an interesting book. I mean, it's both I think historical and also like very current in terms of how it's addressing this moment in time. I guess like the post 2010s. And I guess before we jump into some of the sort of scenes in the book, why don't you just give us an idea of how this book came about and why you wrote it?
Yeah, I've been working on this book full time for 4 years, but in a larger sense, it's the product of 10 years of me trying to figure out exactly what happened to this hope in social media and mass protests in general, but very specifically what happened to Brazil after this uprising, this popular revolt that was caused by a left anarchist group in June 2013, and that turned out very differently than they or anybody else on the left would have hoped in Brazil, which is where I've lived primarily since 2010. So in the years that followed, and I not only paid close attention to what was happening in Brazil, the ultimate impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, the imprisonment of Lula, the election of Jair Bolsonaro, probably the most extreme right leader elected in the world. Every time there was another mass protest explosion in some other place, I'd pay very close attention and think, oh, I hope it doesn't go the way and it did usually. So I decided in 2019, before the Jakarta Method came out, to really take a look at all of this history, starting with Tunisia in 2010, and try to see if placing it in a single story, creating one global history, might make some of this a little bit more intelligible.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most interesting things about the book, at least for me, is you're doing it chronologically, and also you kind of mix in some of your own personal experience reporting for these various outlets. But you begin the book sort of laying out this broader kind of theoretical framework of social movements, and I think you're thinking critically about this idea of a leaderless movement. And I'll be honest, like, when I first got into organizing or like got political or first was introduced to politics, it was through actually punk rock music and skating of all things. And of course that tends to lean towards like the sort of like left anarchist sort of milieu. And so a lot of the things that you're writing about, like the Society of the Spectacle, the Situationists, the 1968 sort of French Revolution, or uprising that happened, was really speaking to like some of the things that I was reading early on as a kid. And I think you also talk about how you participated in these anti-war protests when you were in California. I think I was still in high school, but I was still participating in those as well. And so there's some sort of and then of course we all lived through the era or the decade of mass protest. But can you talk a little bit about this sort of departure, so to speak, or this kind of antagonism between what is quote unquote called the old left and how the new left, so to speak, attempted to foment different kinds of struggle?
Yeah, absolutely. And I had a similar experience. Like, I put this in the book, I think. I don't know how explicitly I put it, but like a lot of the tactics and approaches that we see in the mass protest decade, or in the 2010s, what I call the mass protest decade, come out of the anti-globalization or alter-globalization movement. And I remember myself like kind of learning what the internet was through indie media, like deep sort of either left libertarian or anarchist assumptions, I think really shot through a lot of the ways that my generation, I guess I'm a little bit older than you, that our generation kind of came into politics, and like music and subcultural approaches were all really important. So to start this story of the 2010s, I go back and try to trace, because what I say at the beginning of the book is that by the 2010s, a certain repertoire of contention, a certain recipe of tactics became to be hegemonic, if not seeming entirely natural, by the 2010s. And this is, as you say, apparently spontaneous, leaderless, horizontally organized, digitally coordinated mass protests in public spaces or squares. And like anything else, it's not natural. It emerged from very specific historical circumstances, ideological and material. And so to explain how it became natural and obvious to us that was the right way to respond to injustice, I try to take apart all these elements and trace them back to their historical antecedents and sort of do a quick intellectual history of this approach. And a lot of it has to do with the emergence of the New Left, especially in North America, especially a generation in the 1960s that was trying to do politics in a more moral way than their predecessors. But also they were acting in a moment in which they were, I think, objectively some of the richest and most privileged subjects in human history, as I was when I went to UC Berkeley 40 years later. And they were operating in a deeply anti-communist milieu. They were trying to avoid what they saw as the heirs of the Bolshevik Revolution. And so I sort of argue, or I look at statements made back then to come to the conclusion that in many ways they just sort of inverted what Lenin's revolutionary practice was, or at least what they understood it to be. And they wanted to create revolutionary practices which would be a prefiguration now of the world that they wanted to create, which is not something they exactly created, but they brought it back to the center of protest and indeed political struggles in the North Atlantic. And they were fundamentally suspicious of hierarchy, and they were sort of deeply individualist and libertarian, as I think sort of like every American. I think we're just like, the United States is just like a deeply, deeply individualistic and libertarian society. Radical liberalism is much more common in the US than any kind of proper leftism, and I think it always sort of has been. I think it's deep in our ideological roots. And so they wanted to avoid any practices that could be seen in any way as authoritarian, even to the extent of like electing a leader of the organization and deciding what was going to happen next. So the New Left and its relationship to what it perceived as the Old Left and what it perceived as the heirs of the Russian Revolution ends up becoming really important for creating a certain one of the ideological strands that I trace to the beginning of the 2010s.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about this concept of prefigurative politics that somehow, and like you cite people like David Graeber, who's an anarchist anthropologist, who's like, they kind of valorize this idea of like the organization, the means becomes the end, like meaning you have to create the world that you eventually want to see. And I don't want to get into the critiques of that, but I do want to say there's one element that it may not be sort of explicit. Maybe it is explicit, but there's another kind of actor in all of this, and that's the media, right? And like how the media is selecting the sort of like spectacles that it participates, or that are sort of like engendered in this moment. Like SDS itself is as much a media spectacle as it is, a student organization. It's not a sort of hegemonic sort of organization, but then it lands itself at the center of this sort of broader kind of, a discussion about the Vietnam War and student protests and things like that. Not because it represented sort of the largest, the sort of mass aspirations of U.S. society, but simply because it was engaged in a kind of spectacle of protest. And
they discovered this on accident. They kind of backed into this.
Yeah, no, and it's I think in some ways, if you read the FBI files on some of these leaders, the FBI itself was also playing into a lot of this and how they surveilled leaders and how they demonized them or attempted to sort of discredit them in the eyes of the media. But how does this the media plays also a central role in like and you start with the no fares movement, or is it the free fares movement? I can't remember exactly how it translates.
You could translate either way. They're both right. Yeah.
Yeah, so the free fares movement in Brazil starts as this kind of small kind of anarchist collective, and then it lands itself again in the sort of media spotlight, and that's sort of your entry point into talking about this kind of decade of mass protests. But maybe explain that situation, because you seem to be very familiar with these individuals.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I first was in contact with some of the MPL, the Movimento Passe Livre, or Free Fare Movement, or your translation was good too, back in 2013. And then for the book, I spent a couple of years doing lots and lots of interviews with a couple of the members. And as I claim at the very beginning of the book, mass protest is something that emerges in a mediatized society. It wouldn't have made sense if you think of like an imaginary medieval village. It doesn't make sense to sort of go to the center of the nation. The nation doesn't exist yet, and to demonstrate to the entire country if nobody's going to see you except for the people that can literally see you with their own eyes, right? Before mass media, mass protest makes a lot less sense. And what the SDS discovers, to their horror, some of them are horrified by this, and others think, oh, this is good. I can become kind of a celebrity. They discover that what they do will be so amplified by the media that really the relationship with the coverage ends up being more important than anything they could do directly interacting with individuals, which was their plan when they were founded in the early 1960s. And so what happens bizarrely in 2013, and I lived through this, I was there on the streets, is that Protest 1, 2, 3, and as you say, this is a group that comes out of, they largely have anarchist ideals. They're explicitly horizontalist. They come out of the anti-globalization movement. A lot of them worked in indie media Brazil. They've been agitating, anytime there's a price rise in bus fares or in Brazil since 2005, they throw a protest. They throw raucous street demonstrations. They get involved in direct action. This is what they do. They've always been doing it. But what happens very strangely in June 2013 is that on the morning of the fourth protest that they have planned in June, which I attend, it's just around the corner from my house in downtown Sao Paulo, the mass media call for the police, the military police, and this is a legacy of the US-backed dictatorship, to crack down on the protests, to repress them, to do what cops do, get out there, clear the streets, repress these punks and these anarchists. They're causing a mess. We've had enough of this. But what happens is the cops do exactly what they're trained to do, and they actually repress the people on the streets, including people like me, white journalists, people, in quote unquote innocent bystanders, people that are not part of the protests. Most notably Juliana Valloni, who I have known more or less for a decade as well, who works for one of Brazil's most respected and mainstream newspapers. And so when the Brazilian people, and especially the mass media that asked for this crackdown, when they see images of what it actually looks like when police crack down on people, which is something that Black and brown Brazilians knew very, very well, they've known for hundreds of years, they're horrified by this, and they entirely shift their narrative. The media says, well, actually, this is a glorious uprising in defense of, and then they insert their own idea of what it's about. And because the media in Brazil is oligarch owned and lean center right, they insert different values than ones than the original organizers would have wanted them to insert. They said, well, this is a glorious uprising in defense of freedom of expression in the abstract sense, or it's anti-corruption, or it's against the government, or it's a patriotic outpouring of contentless affirmation of the form of protest itself. And so what happens between the fourth and the fifth protest is that you get an entirely new wave of people coming in, and I'm at both, an entirely new wave of people that, as I discussed with one of the members of the Free Fire movement in the book, they're not showing up to the protest. They're showing up to the protest that they think exists because they saw it on TV, which doesn't exist. And this strange conflict between the people that have actually been on the streets for the first four protests and the people trying to join something which does not exist, but yet comes into existence through their arrival on the scene, causes a real conflict, which I think arguably Brazil has not recovered from since. And then just 1 week later, between protest 4 and I think maybe 6 or 7, some of the organized leftists that were part of radical political parties that formed the core of the early protests are violently expelled by far right or anti-political, but ultimately, they're clearly become Bolsonaristas a few years down the road. The new arrivals end up violently expelling the people that actually put the thing together in the first place because they showed up to something that they heard about and decided to make it their own.
Yeah, and I think it's this sort of plays out in several scenarios around the world that you follow. And I think it's really fascinating too, because, you can't control the way the media represents, the sort of the reason why you're doing something. And so they're going to, you talk about like how Bloomberg News comes in and kind of, has its own spin. You have your own spin. We're not objective. We're all invested in some kind of ideology or bias in some ways. All these other kind of outlets come in and have their own spin, and the way it's portrayed to the broader Brazilian society is sort of up to who they're actually listening to, where they're getting their media, how they're getting their media. Of course, this kind of translates across different sort of social media spheres, especially like Twitter, and so I think when I was reading this kind of section, I was like, it's not. I'm not trying to like pinpoint it on anarchists, but there's this kind of tendency sometimes, I think, to in the sort of attempt to be prefigurative, in the attempt to sort of be like, well, we recognize political parties are bad, and even though we're not like entirely against the Brazilian government at this moment in time, we are critical, and we want it to expand the social welfare state, not being sort of, I guess, entirely like clear about those sort of intentions in the beginning kind of leads to some unintended consequences, right? And I wanted to, there's like two kind of pieces, or three instances that I think are really contentious in the left in this book, and one would be the Syrian case, what happens in Ukraine, and then also what happens in Hong Kong, because we see in the Ukrainian situation. Well, I'd also say Libya too. The Libyan situation was also incredibly tense and very violent, right? So there's this, I guess, in the popular media, people were seeing protests erupt, and it was dubbed the Arab Spring. There was a lot of young people at Tahrir Square who were pushing for these really radical changes and challenging the sort of what they saw as the kind of they saw a lot of different things. But maybe you can talk about how Tahrir Square and that example kind of becomes a stand-in for a lot of different a lot of different other protests that sort of align. Some of them are definitely aligned with that kind of spirit, but some of them are not really aligned with that spirit.
Absolutely, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think your critique is fair. I think that I don't think you're being unfair to this particular package of contention in saying that it allows itself sometimes to be represented from outside, or it allows for outside actors to take advantage of the situation. Libya is a really classic example, right? Because of course, people had very good reason to be upset with Gaddafi, just like most people have a reason to be upset with most leaders that have ever existed. But NATO uses this as an excuse to launch a regime change operation and destroys a country, right? So the reason I say that I don't think you're being unkind is a lot of the people who felt this way, and this is something that emerges throughout the book. A lot of the people that felt this way in 2010 would agree with you now that particular form does allow for people like me in the international media to play too large of a role in defining what the protest means, because the protest is not defining for itself to the world what it means, and opens the space for outside actors to intervene in an imperialist or opportunistic way. But you're absolutely right that Tahrir Square ends up functioning as this kind of bat signal to the world of like, look at this amazing people-led uprising, and look at these amazing scenes, look at this amazing, inspiring I think I call it in the book, and I'm not trying to be sarcastic, like a carnival of prefiguration. Like first you have the revolution in Tunisia, which is started, and this is, often neglected, but really like radical leftists and unions play a role in making that happen from the very beginning. Egypt is to some extent inspired by Tunisia, but Egypt, that scene in Tahrir Square of the people taking downtown Cairo and living in communion with people across sort of different boundaries in Egyptian society is like an incredibly powerful media spectacle that continues to be copied throughout the rest of the decade. And I think this is a strength and a weakness of social media, because what you see is that model is copied not only in countries with wildly different political and economic systems. It is not only adopted in countries that have entirely different national histories and governments. It continues to be copied after the original Tahrir revolution doesn't work out, after it becomes clear that doesn't work out in the long run. And as you say, this particular repertoire, back in the 2010s, I mean, I remember this, back in 2010, 2011, it was viewed as sort of almost automatically assumed that this particular repertoire of contention, that people rushing to the streets because of digital coordination, that internet-led stuff would automatically be progressive and liberatory and democratic. And this is quite complicated if you think about it, because everybody has their own ideas of what liberation democracy means. But back then, everybody's all thought that it was going to work out for them. As we get further and further in the decade, it becomes clear that no, anybody can do this. And this is why the quick chapter on Indonesia in 2016 is interesting, because an Islamist group do this to try to get the governor of Jakarta imprisoned for committing blasphemy based on fake news on Facebook, basically, and it works. As you get further down the decade, it becomes clear that anybody can adopt this kind of thing. And I think now in 2023, you probably get the exact opposite interpretation of what you would in 2011. If I were to describe in 2023 the scene of a swarm of angry young men descending on the Capitol because of something they saw on the internet, the average person would think, oh, well, this could be bad. Red flags might go off. Whereas in 2011, it was just like, well, anytime that happens, it's history with a capital H pushing us towards a global situation in which everybody is free in whatever way that I believe that we should be free. And this really flips as we learn that, the repertoire is going to be used by anyone. Social media can be used by anyone. And indeed, and this is sort of the tragic thing in the book, indeed, people with even the best intentions can get wrapped up in an uprising in which bad actors can take advantage of the chaos and impose their own will on the country.
Yeah, and man, I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole, but sometimes, well, I'll just say this. I'll use like a real world example. Like one time, I was at this kind of broadly left fair, and there's all these kind of different political tendencies. They all had their tables out, and I went to this one table that was run by some, let's just say, green anarchists, for lack of a better term. And they had a pamphlet there, and it was called this a pamphlet of sabotage, but there was no it was how to sabotage snowmobiles, how to sabotage ATVs and things like that, or it was kind of this eco sort of protest thing. And I was sitting there thinking, I was like, there's no ideology here. Technically anyone could pick up this pamphlet, and it's it's kind of it's validating or legitimizing these kind of fears of a eco-terrorism. But the eco-terrorism isn't necessarily left or right. It's just telling you tactics on how to do something. And I was like, there's a danger here, especially when you're kind of valorizing a sort of tactic or a kind of I guess from the anarchist phrase, the propaganda of the deed, when there isn't, a clear sort of ideological message. And I think for me, at least reading this book, the kind of clearest example was the Euromaidan, uprising, and that happened in Ukraine. And like how, and I had a friend who was in Ukraine at that time, and he was like, yeah, CNN was there, the major media was there, and they would have, the people with the Ukrainian flags, and they would do their thing. And then at night, they would come and tear down a Soviet statue, and all the Nazis would come out, like the fascists, so to speak. And he was like, it was such a weird thing because, a lot of the protesters who were they were protesting for, like, their anti-corruption, trying to expand, like trying to create the democracy that they were supposedly promised. But it was also, there was this really organized kind of like, right-wing faction. And he said at some point, it was just like people just they got so enmeshed that there was a confusion, about like what people were doing. And anyways, I don't know if you can talk a little bit specifically about the Maidan protest, because it ends really, I mean, it doesn't end, but it's a really violent kind of form of street protest that's happening. And you point this out, that how the Ukrainian kind of state becomes hollowed out, so to speak, or it becomes corrupted, and what is civil society in Ukraine is essentially like Western backed like NGOs, and how that sort of plays out in this particular moment.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to make clear that that's even like people that tell me that are people that work for Western backed NGOs, and they say, we wish we didn't have to rely on funding from actors in the EU and North America to put together these organizations, but we do. Because, as you say, Ukraine, and this is, it's really important to make this point, like Ukrainians got like a horrible deal after the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Like everybody basically in Ukraine had a very good reason to be upset in 2010 or 2014, as many people around the world do, because the economy was absolutely in tatters. There was this back and forth of leadership that often just ended in like, but despite all of the hopes for the leader that came before, it was more, the country was divided. So these were different voting blocks, but the people that were so excited about the leader before Yanukovych, well, he ended with like 4 or 5% approval rating. So everybody had quite a good reason to be upset. And as you say, the crackdown, which is the same thing that brings people into the streets in many, many other parts of the world, that brought people, that really swarmed, that really led people to pour into the square. People came in for a lot of reasons, which I think would be sympathetic to, a lot of people wanted de-oligarchization. They wanted more economic opportunities. They were just protesting police brutality. But Yanukovych did win the election. This is a tactic, which is a strain. It's like you got to a point where, okay, there's a lot of people massed in front of the centers of power in the capital of Ukraine. We have all this energy. We have all this momentum. We're out here. What do we do with that? And the country remained essentially split. I mean, at the peak of the Maidan protests, they had about 50% of support in the country. As you point out, Western media tend to be sympathetic to movements like this that take place in opposition to geopolitical or perceived geopolitical rivals. So they had this on their side. But in this moment of like, okay, we're here, what are we going to do? Actors which are organized, disciplined, and committed to a particular ideological outcome, like the far right in Ukraine, are able to punch above their weight. Now, I'm not claiming that they end up being the most important, or that the whole movement becomes dominated by them, but they play a larger role than they should, given their very low amount of support in society, because they're able to take advantage of this situation in the square, and their participation does end up changing the very particular way that Euromaidan ends, and indeed the way that Ukrainians in the east of the country, not only because of the facts on the ground in the capital, but because of the media that they're consuming and the way that media is representing the square to them, this ends up changing the way that ends up influencing the final outcome of Euromaidan.
Yeah, and I think it's, there was recently an incident that happened in Canada where Justin Trudeau sort of or no, I don't know if it was Justin Trudeau. It was God, whoever. I don't know how their parliament system works, but they ended up having a standing ovation for a Ukrainian, person who he was like 90 years old. He came to Canada, but he ended up like fighting with one of these Nazi
He was
units.
he was an SS. He was in an SS unit. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And the point that I think there's a tendency to, like there's at this moment in time when I was reading this book, I was like also how these kind of like right wing Ukrainian nationalists and fascists are actually rewriting Ukrainian history as well, because as you point out in that chapter, it's like there was a lot of favorability towards the Soviet Union, and in fact, like I think it was like between 7 to 10 million Ukrainians fought for the Red Army against the Nazis, and only like I think it was maybe 250,000, like 250,000, if that, actually fought for like Nazi in these like these Nazi units. But yet that's the history that becomes memorialized in this moment in time. This like this minority faction, and how I guess like how like even though they were sort of a minority, even in this moment in time, they become sort of the history now. And now, like, Stepan Bandera is kind of like a national hero. He's, we see like there's kind of this internet phenomenon, I guess, on social media to kind of point out Nazi symbology on Ukrainian, fighters in these moments. But anyways, this I think is incredibly, kind of important too, because it speaks to the Brazilian kind of context a little bit as well. And I think it's kind of what I like about this book is that actually like you kind of you decenter the United States, but you provincialize the US and the Western world, and you center like Brazil. And so in some ways, like the kind of movements that are happening are actually read through a lot of kind of perspective, like Brazilian perspectives. Cause like even Dilma Rousseff has to confront, like the protests that are happening against her. Like Erdogan is like calling her and being like, this happened to me.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Turkey.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And like, just to respond quickly to what you said on Ukraine, like the degree to which my approach, I think, is interesting, if it is at all, is that what you've just described, let's not what you described exactly, but the dynamic of the far right showing up to the street movement happened to all three of the uprisings that I describe in the book in 2013. So in Brazil in June 2013, the far right shows up on the streets. In Gezi Park in Turkey, the far right shows up. In Ukraine, the far right shows up. The far right shows up because this particular type of situation, an extended street battle essentially, or extended street occupation, is a situation in which they're going to do very well. Now, another thing that is common across the decade, and this relates to the dynamic that you just kind of outlined, is that after the success of Maidan, or after the success of the putative success of any of these given movements, the elites that take advantage of the movement, the actual new government that is formed, consists of existing elites rather than the movement itself taking power. And the existing elites are not going to deliver the de-oligarchization that was one of the key demands at the beginning of the Maidan. They're not going to deliver economic justice because that's against their interests. But what they can do is deliver on the cultural side. And so what you do is, I would probably say that you get more of it's a spectrum. You get Ukrainian politics moving a little bit in this direction, a little bit away from the glorification of Soviet history, and more towards the idea that the UPA and Stepan Bandera were part of national history. And indeed, I spent a lot of the summer of 2021 in Ukraine doing interviews across the country. And indeed, there was like a monument to UPA in the center of Kiev. So you get, I wouldn't say that this one idea replaced another, but what elites delivered is a movement in one direction on the cultural question. And Ukraine, like many, many others, was a very divided country. And this really alienated some people in the East, and it made some people in the West very happy. And that's because, and this is something that you see across the decade, when elites are able to take advantage of the success of a protest movement, they often aren't going to do something which is they're not often not going to deliver on economic justice. That's something you really have to extract from elites. But they can deliver something on culture. They can wage culture war as a way to act as if they are responding to the legitimate demands from the streets. And again, like, this is a dynamic that you see across countries, and this is why I want to put Ukraine in this larger story, not to demonstrate that it is precisely not like an outlier. It's just that the forces at work are slightly different, and then the ways that in which this explosion, just where the pieces fall, is slightly different. But it's not only in Ukraine that the far right comes out. And yeah, absolutely. I think they're like the only like real American character in this book is me. And the only reason that I really include myself is as a way to be quite critical about English language global media. Indeed, my own performance. I think that my profession needs to be not held account, because my profession needs to be, we need to be honest about the ways in which the failures of my profession are a problem in the long term. And just as you were outlining with destruction for destruction's sake, I don't think that just blowing up mainstream corporate journalism and hoping something better comes along is the way to go. I think that if you just got rid of the mainstream corporate outlets, then oligarchs would just step into that power vacuum and create propaganda that serves their own interests. I think that my profession, mainstream English language journalism, like any government, like any other activity with an important social function, requires constant scrutiny and constant self-improvement and constant criticism, so that we can do a better job next time around. The U.S. is not really in the book, except in the countries where it shows up as one of the actors, and it's not the only actor in what I call the mass protest decade to show up and take advantage of power vacuums created by this street of explosions.
That actually, gets to my next question, because Hong Kong, you were talking about the Hong Kong protests and how, there's a lot to kind of say about it. And I'm glad you pointed out, like, even the kind of relative standard of living was much higher. There was sort of a xenophobic, right-wing movement. There always has been. It's not just, it didn't just appear out of nowhere from the protests itself. But, you have some like key figures like Joshua Wong, who's like coming to the United States and like, shaking hands with
Marco Rubio.
Yeah. Well, he did. There's a photo with him, like with Mike Pompeo as well, and I think he mentions him in his biography. I have to go back and read that. But he's like kind of aligning, and he's like also not like a democratically like selected leader of the movement, but he's a media. He's as much as a leader as he is a media sensation, and I think you make that like very clear. You call it the platform of the movement, but how even the movement itself, because I was like questioning myself, like I was like, so what's they have the goals, they have the five goals that they're trying to accomplish, but what's like the end goal other than getting media attention? Because that seemed like a big part of the movement. And so is that like, I'm not asking you to answer this question, but I was like, so what are you building power for? Is this a movement about building power, or is it just to kind of capture sort of media attention? And then I was thinking about, this is, the whole question about the Apple Daily. I was just listening to NPR. They did a whole profile on I think his name is Jimmy Lai, who was the founder of the Apple Daily. And he, he's kind of very much a reactionary figure in Hong Kong, but he plays like a big role in a lot of this, kind of fomenting and trying to co-opt these street protests. Maybe you could just kind of flesh that out a little bit, because if people have heard of that, I don't know, some of our listeners may know about it, but it's like, it's kind of confusing. It was confusing for a lot of indigenous people. Like, there was in Canada and British Columbia, they were like asking indigenous movements to condemn the Communist Party of China, and people were really confused because these Hong Kong protesters were waving Canadian flags, and they're like, this is the Canadian government is like, we don't agree with them, so they were trying to draw out these kind of parallels, and it just wasn't making sense to a lot of folks. But maybe you can help us kind of unpack that situation, how it arose, but also sort of the media element.
Yeah. So once more, I think the usefulness of my approach, if indeed there is any, is to place Hong Kong, just like all of these other mass protest events, alongside each other to see what sort of emerges. And what you describe as, you say it's confusing, but this dynamic, this sort of fundamental illegibility of what's actually happening, what is this for, and indeed this flattening in which one moment in the mass protest movement is equated for another, or one episode is allowed to stand in for all the other people that were there earlier. This is again common across what I call the mass protest decade. And what I argue is that this particular form of contention ends up rendering the movements illegible. So people end up picking and choosing their preferred moments based on often the ideological sympathies of the journalist or the outlet or the movement around the world. And you get this strange situation where, for example, there are moments in Hong Kong in 2019 when quite a lot of normal people are in the streets asking for the government not to go forward with the extradition bill. But then you have 3-4 months later, different people on the street doing different things with different ideological approaches, very different tactical approaches. And depending on what your who you are and what your sympathies are, you may act as if these people now 4 months later are the exact same thing as this movement of regular people that just want to get rid of the extradition bill. Because Carrie Lam, I mean, in a very imperfect way, and I think any historian of 2019 in Hong Kong would fault her for doing this poorly. But she did, not long after these mass protests against the extradition bill, put it on, shelve it. It wasn't going to go through. She said, okay, essentially, because, whatever this weird little post-colonial governance system they have in Hong Kong is, protest had worked in the past, and this one, okay, enough people seem to be against this extradition bill, although it was a kind of a strange way to make the larger case, which is, I think, really about the encroachment on Hong Kong autonomy. But okay, that worked essentially. But then later in the year, you get this very, very mediatized, and this is, I don't want to speak about it or for it really, but people that were really deeply involved in it told me later in the year, yes, we believe that we got caught in a loop of seeking media attention in a way which was not connected to some long-term revolutionary strategy. Yes, people got, people in the movement, that especially those that were xenophobic, racist, or even violent, ended up committing abuses, which kind of were even either allowed to stand in for what everybody else was about, or at the very least they were happening. You get some really horrible episodes later in the year, which go viral among those people who want to use it as a way to interpret the entire movement and are sort of ignored by the people that want to say, well, actually, it's all about this earlier movement. And then the excessive decentralization is something that a lot of Hong Kongers told me they believed was ultimately a problem. But again, there's also a lot of Hong Kongers that would disagree with everything that I just said, because this is such a fundamentally contradictory and illegible type of mass protest. And this is, just like in June 2013 in Brazil. I often, sometimes to explain it, I say that I spent a lot of this summer with the MST, the Brazil's landless workers movement in the countryside, but then I spent a lot of the early fall speaking with Bolsonaristas in the capital of Brazil. And a lot of Bolsonaristas will say, our movement was born on the streets in June 2013. We are a right-wing movement that learned how to take power, that was born in the glorious protests of June 2013. Anti-authoritarian leftists, anarchists, and left critics of the PT will say June 2013 was about better public services. It was about getting the people on the streets to stand up and ask for an expanded welfare state. They're both right. But these absolutely contradictory interpretations of June 2013 are possible, and I think both equally sustainable. So in Hong Kong, while a lot of people absolutely told me it was really regrettable the degree to which xenophobic and violent elements ran rampant late in 2019, people told me we got caught in a media loop seeking attention from sympathetic Western media in a way which was not really in the long-term interests of the movement or whatever it was that the original people on the street were asking for. One of the, very notably, one of the organizers of the original mass marches says that he believes that the movement was used by Washington, used by the government of the United States, that many people thought that sort of this turn to the West would be helpful, but in the end, they were just totally abandoned, and it seemed that the West was more interested in their failure rather than their success. But again, a lot of people would have the exact opposite interpretation, because this type of this repertoire of contention, this package of protest tactics that I trace as hegemonic in the 2010s allows for endless contradiction within the movement, and certainly in the movements, in the way that the movement is interpreted globally.
I want to ask some kind of more specific questions about Brazil, and specifically the MST, because there's one thing, and I was thinking about this. This book made me think a lot, because it's like that whole decade was really intense, in terms of everything that was happening. And I remember even when Hong Kong was, underway, there was the coup in Bolivia, and there was people I knew. I wasn't friends with them. There was people I knew and followed who were literally sharing stages with fascists, because they were so against the Moss and the Evo Morales. They seen him such as a corrupt figure that they're willing to stand on the stage with fascists. And granted, they were like critical. They were saying stuff like, they're critiquing Camacho and stuff. But at the end of the day, I was like, was there a critical reflection, or was it just like, what was it how did you end up in this moment in time where you're sharing stage with like literal, I'm not like, these aren't just like, I'm not, Camacho is a literal fascist. I think he would own that term. It's not like I'm like making him into a caricature. And so it was just like, I was kind of taken back by a lot of these, these scenarios. But I think you did a good job at kind of like diving back into like how people, wound up in this moment, and kind of maybe got caught up in these, I guess, popular uprisings that, were ended up co-opted. And you talk you're very, you're looking at a kind of, I guess, history of protest that's critical of the old left, right? But at the same time, I feel like you're kind of invoking the old left in saying that like there is a utility to a popular front kind of, mobilization, to say that, in the moment of like Bolsonaro, and to kind of like get him unelected, it requires bringing together these people who were formerly antagonistic, and even kind of uniting liberal left kind of progressive forces with far left kind of forces to defeat what is commonly known as the big enemy. And so how do you, is that, I don't know, maybe I'm drawing conclusions where there doesn't deserve to be conclusions, but in some ways it's like I kind of feel like the solution here that you're saying, and even the ways that they have defeated, temporarily, I guess, through the ballot box, have defeated some of these elements, is by kind of using the tactics. It's almost like they're rediscovering the tactics of the old left. I don't know if that's,
I think that's,
if I'm way
no,
far
I think
off
that's
base.
right. I think that's right. And I think that, as I put at the end of the book, like a lot of people that I spoke to at the end of the mass protest decade stay in the same place ideologically, but a lot of people move. And when they move, they all move back towards an old left, or even perhaps a Leninist conception of revolutionary practice. And I'm again, like just in the case of Ukraine, it's more of a spectrum than a flip. It's more like a bit, back this way rather than a full adoption. But yes, absolutely. Some people move fully back to a some people take away for some people the lesson that is learned at the end of the mass protest decade is just read Lenin. Some people the lesson is a more of what I would call like an anti-Leninism, which consists of saying we can't avoid doing every single thing that the Bolsheviks did just because we don't like the way that worked out, because obviously because some of that stuff works. We can't just do a complete inversion of the things that we didn't like. And yeah, absolutely. I think that you're right to characterize that movement at the end of the book. People move back towards, if not a Leninist conception, or at least an anti-Leninist conception of revolutionary practice. In Bolivia, as you point out, I only put this as like 2 or 3 sentences in the books, but I hope I hope it's like by the end it's kind of a gut punch, because Bolivia is a great reminder of what role mass protest has often had in Latin American history. There were protests before the U.S. backed coup in 1964 in Brazil. There were protests before a coup that overthrew Salvador Allende. Somehow at the beginning of the 2010s, we all thought that like any time that people rush into the streets, that's obviously going to be good for whatever I believe in. But, before reactionary military seizures of power, it usually makes sense in the Latin American context to get the middle class and reactionary elements of the ruling class out on the street to provide cover for what you're about to do. And so in 2019, you absolutely have protests. Absolutely. Some of those people on the streets are there for what they believe to be the best vision of Bolivian future. The protests lead to a military coup, right? And so all of those things can be true at the same time. And at the very end of the decade, Bolivia is a really in your face reminder of the ways that protests can be used by anyone.
Yeah, I think there's, I guess that I hate this phrase, but it's like that cuts both ways.
Yeah.
But it's like also like how political parties can also, or I guess like when they become institutionalized, can be reactionary towards things that are legitimate grievances, right? And I think there is, I'm not saying that like there are some times, like I think Dilma Rousseff, for example, when she was responding to these protests, she's like, this is an exercise of democracy. Like we've been living under a military dictatorship for X amount of years. I was tortured because I was a Marxist guerrilla. Like I am a perfect living example of like why these protests are good. And I'm listening, and I'm even in that whole scene when you have her in, her watching the protests, but she's turned the sound off and she's only reading the signs because she's trying to internalize what everyday people are saying. Like that to me actually shows a lot of depth in kind of her character at that time. I'm not defending what ultimate actions that she ended up taking. I think some of which alienated her from that base, but at the same time she's like smart enough and she's a leftist enough to understand that like there's something wrong here and I actually need to figure out what's happening. But at the same time I'm not going to just toe the U.S. line on this. I'm not gonna denounce other kind of powers that I'm economic kind of relationships that I have. I'm not gonna like forego certain things. But yeah, there's some lessons to be learned, and I wanted to ask you about this because you mentioned I think in that that first kind of like that first kind of moment in like 2013 when like you have the PSOL, which is a sort of left kind of breakaway party from PT, as I understand it. Could be wrong about that. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then you also have the MST, who were kind of they're not a political party, they're a movement. But there's millions of members. They're massive, and yeah, and they have. There's several questions that kind of arose in my mind when reading that moment, but then also kind of reading towards the end of the book about the Brazilian situation. Is that MST is organized. They kind of have I guess from what my interactions with them have been that they have this kind of popular front approach. they align with the PT even though they're not like fully integrated within the PT. The ruling party right now, and but they're also incredibly organized, and they do demonstrate. I don't know if they've ever done mass protests that culminated in things that happened in 2013, but definitely they're a political force to be reckoned with. How do you see that sort of example within the context of Brazil, but also kind of to add another kind of layer to that question is that many of these cases that you're talking about are very urban centered. In Brazil, a lot of the struggles that you mentioned it kind of briefly in here, a lot of the struggles happen in a kind of rural environment that don't really get accounted for.
Yeah, no. So all of that I think is really right and important. So that's what I put myself in the book, and one of the reasons that I do so is that it's an excuse to critique my own profession and my own performance. Another reason is that, where am I at the beginning of June when all these protests start, I'm like deep in the interior where an indigenous tribe has just been attacked by literal cowboys who are engaged in sort of the murderous process of clearing the land that is not only very familiar to the North American history, it is often explicitly modeled on, they are like these people that really looked up to like the cowboy history, or like the John Wayne version of the cowboy history that is sold by the United States in the years afterwards. And the reason I do this is to drive home one of the points that you were alluding at with Dilma, is that this mass protest explosion in June 2013 is profoundly confusing for the organizers of the protest itself, the Movimento Passe Livre, profoundly confusing for the government, for Dilma, who's trying to figure out how I can respond to the demands on the streets. And in this really strange way, locks these groups in conflict when they both agree on what should be the situation out in the rural countryside where I was 2 weeks earlier. They both agree that really what needs to happen in the interior of the country is a defense of the Amazon, a defense of indigenous sovereignty, a defense, fighting back against rapacious agricultural interests, which are often genocidal. They agree on all of those really big things, but somehow there's this explosion that no one knows how to read, no one knows how to respond to. And Dilma is sitting there, as you say. She turns off the sound and is trying to read the screen, be like, well, how do I respond? What do I do that could be the correct response to this? And this is, as I say, this is sort of, I think, endemic to the nature of the movement itself. Now, the MST, the reason, not the real reason I'm writing an article, a big article about them. I think that there hasn't been something big in English written on the MST in a while, and I'm trying to sort of give an overview of what's happening. One of the reasons that I was drawn to that particular journalistic project this year is it is kind of an answer to the final questions raised by the book, because the MST has the kind of formal and hierarchical structure which is also democratic and flexible, which is which is why so many social movements around the world have so much respect for them. They have maybe 1 million people that are involved in the movement, but yet they can shift tactically based on what's happening in Brazil, because they have essentially a democratic centralist structure. They decide on things democratically, and then everybody works collectively towards whatever that line is. And under Bolsonaro, they stop doing land occupations, or at least they step back to a large extent, and they focus on forming links with sort of progressive elements of the urban bourgeoisie, as they probably put it. They have quite a Marxist conception of class and history. And then when Lula comes back, they shift again. And this is something that you can only do if you have tight organization and truly democratic decision-making processes with which the MST does. Now, I don't think I put this in the book, but in June 2013, they have a couple attempts at interventions they try really hard to get involved here in what happens. They know the MPL, the Movimento Passe Livre. They've been indeed serving vegetarian food at punk shows in Sao Paulo for 15 years. There's this there's this like, this cauldron of sort of left movements and punks that they all knew each other. And early in June 2013, the MST gets involved and they try to set up negotiations. They're like, no, just talk to the government. Like, we can get you in a room with the president. We believe in negotiation. Because the MST, while they are very, very radical, they also believe in in the extraction of concessions from the state in the short term, and putting food on the table for their members on a daily basis, as well as their long-term commitment to socialist revolution in the ideal case. So at the beginning, they try to organize a conversation between the MPL and the PT. This doesn't work. The MPL has decided in advance that they're betting on mass uprising or popular revolt as the way to get the bus fare revoked. Then, when sort of the whole country joins the protest, the MST joins too, trying to sort of influence whatever is going to be happening on the streets in the same way that some leftists in Ukraine, even though they don't like a lot of the people on the street, they think, well, we're going to try to influence it in this way or that way. And then some of them end up being expelled, some end up staying, some end up switching sides indeed. The MST gets involved, and then they are also basically expelled from the streets in late June. But what they're able to do from June 2013 to 2022, and this is something that many, many other left groups or progressive organizations or progressive individuals, because properly speaking, we're talking about an individualist era. The MST is able to, they're very, very proud of this. When Lula's in jail, they put their members on the street outside the prison calling for his release every single day that he's in jail. And this is, again, something they can do because of their tight organization, because people that are in the organization have a reason to be in it. In the short term, the organization helps them materially. In the long term, their commitment to this ideological project. And also they have discipline. Like they can kind of give orders. And that's fine. You don't want to be part of the political struggle. That's fine. Then you just don't be an MST. And this is why, and this is really what the piece is about that hopefully will come out later this year. Hopefully I'm not giving too much away. This is why under Bolsonaro, huge amounts of people in like sort of like the more like anti-Bolsonarista sort of progressive, more, less ideologically firmly left elements of Brazilian society. There's a huge amount of sympathy for the MST and what they do. They managed to stay together through the pandemic. They ship tons of food to the cities. They feed people that are starving under Bolsonaro's extreme right government. And this is because their structure has held together for 40 years, and their structure is not only firm, it is flexible. And that's something that a lot of Brazilians, at least, find inspiring in the wake of this unpredictable mass protest explosion.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I just have like kind of two final sort of questions, observations, and one of them is this. Sorry to like we were talking about we're decentering or we're provincializing the United States and Canada, North America, NATO. But I was thinking about this sort of like this kind of I think Naomi Klein calls it the doppelganger effect, and I just would extend her kind of analysis historically to actually say that like as Nazism arose, National Socialism, that's what it was called. It was mimicking the tactics. It was, trying to co-opt the tactics in many ways confusing everyday Germans because about socialism. I mean, they weren't socialists at all. Like by no means were they socialists, but nonetheless, they were kind of capitalizing on the kind of popular sentiments at the time and kind of offering a solution in many ways. Everyone does this false equivalency between Nazism and communism, which is there's no equivalency whatsoever. They're diametrically opposed. Like Nazis always kill communists. It's like always their first kind of
Nazism is born out of a extreme anti-left sentiment. Yeah,
exactly. And I'm not saying that like that's what we're experiencing right now, but definitely there are some elements of that, of a very far right kind of co-opting, and also specifically targeting the left, and I think in general what this book taught me was there is a deep-seated anti-communism within, social movements that are both like progressive, and leftist. There's a kind of suspicion of kind of this party form as if we're all going to end up in some sort of like totalitarian government. And it just makes me think of how effective this kind of anti-communist kind of ideology has infected even things that are considered left, to the point where during the kind of the 1960s, where people are just rejecting the party formation. The Communist Party in the United States had effectively been destroyed in terms of its effectiveness. But then kind of like into the 2010s, I remember I remember in the anti-war movement there was a lot of anti-communist sentiment too, but it was like it was a fear of power. In my, like, looking back at it, it's like we don't actually know what we're gonna do even if we win. Like, what are we gonna do? Are we gonna like elect somebody? Is there an electoral strategy? Do we have like competent leaders to like stand in? And these were like questions. This is like why I left anarchism for these reasons. Because like, okay, first of all, like, all you guys come from the suburbs. Like, I grew up in like rural South Dakota. I'm like brown. I'm poor. Like, like there's got to be something else out there. And but I was just thinking about this in terms of this book, in terms like you very much kind of lay out like they call it there's anti-politics, right? Which I think is important. But I just want to read you this passage because it stuck out in my mind. And this is Mayra and Fernando, two kind of main characters in your book, throughout your book. And they both said the exact same thing in terms of the main lesson that they learned from 2013. And it says, there's no such thing as a political vacuum. Like that, to me, that could also be the title of this book. It's not as cool and flashy as If We Burn, but I would just like you to maybe like kind of meditate on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's a great thing to spend time thinking about. But also like the way that you outlined sort of a deep anti-communism and certain social movement formation. And I think this is especially true in the United States. And again, like a lot of my work, my first book is about the, what can happen as a result of excessive anti-communism. In the case of my first book, it's mass murder carried out in more than 20 countries around the world with the support, with varying levels of support from the United States government. And indeed, like I trace, I think this like reflexive anti-communism that's born out of, not only the McCarthyist moment, but the sort of deep ideological roots of U.S. identity. I've traced this to, indeed, like why punk rock ends up being like anarchist in the first place. Like there's a moment when Malcolm McLaren, he's the manager of the New York Dolls, he dresses them up in hammer and sickle like jumpsuits, and then like in later one of the members of New York Dolls says, well, this was too far. In America, quote, in America, you can be gay, you can be a drug addict, but you cannot be a communist, right? Like the one line that you can never cross is to do something which is too, apparently too similar to what the Soviet Union had been doing. And so I think this runs through a lot of social movement thought that comes out of the United States, especially. And other people around the world say we kind of imported ideas from the United States, which ended up being a bad fit for our movements here. But then Mayra and Fernando at the end of the book, let me try to link these two thoughts, because I think this particular social movement practice and this particular social movement theory creates a repertoire of contention, creates a practice of mass protest, which is better than expected at putting people on the streets, and better than expected at destabilizing or indeed overthrowing governments. Another way to put that is it is better than expected at creating political vacuums, at creating power vacuums. But a protest, especially a protest of this type, of individuals all coming to the streets for their own reasons, cannot take advantage of this type of power vacuum. This particular type of protest, which is profoundly anti-vanguardist, which is apparently spontaneous and leaderless. I think that spontaneity and leaderlessness don't actually exist, but This particular type of mass protest, which is apparently spontaneous, leaderless, horizontally organized, cannot enter the power vacuum and become a new government. You know, when Yanukovych flees in Ukraine, the square doesn't become the state. It is the existing political class that just closes ranks and forms a new state, and you know, delivers on some things and ignores the rest. And indeed, this particular type of mass protest movement cannot even extract concessions from the state. Because to extract concessions from the state like the MST does, you have to send somebody and say, okay, I'm speaking for the MST, just like a union would do. I'm speaking for the MST. We want X and Y. If you give it to us, then we will stop this. But who is supposed to represent this particular type of mass protest explosion? Who can credibly say to Yanukovych or to Trump or to Erdogan in Turkey, okay, if you give us A, B, and C, we'll go home and we'll have a, you know, then we'll you won't hear from us for a while. We're going to go back to the base and do more building. No one can credibly make that case. But so while this particular type of contention cannot extract concessions or create a new state, it can create power vacuums. And so as a good rubric for understanding what happens in the 2010s, you can look to see who's waiting in the wings. You can look to see who rushes in, who takes advantage. And as I said, in Libya, NATO launches a regime change operation. In Ukraine, you get more of the far right taking a role in politics in the capital than they ever deserve. You know, not that they take over the entire state, but there's more representation in the post-Maidan government than they had beforehand, or they ever should have. And then, of course, in the east of the country, Russia plays a role in filling the vacuum created by the mass uprising, either infiltrating the initial responses to the Maidan transfer of power, or indeed, you know, joining the actual war and then ultimately now invading the country. And so those are just quick examples. But if you go across the entire decade, you can see that this particular repertoire of contention is great at creating power vacuums, but horrible at filling them. And so you have to either really like the people that are about to fill the power vacuum, or put up with them, because that tends to be what happens.
And, you know, at the end of the book, you kind of lay out some like media literacy, like what, you know, when you see a quote unquote protest, you know, how should, you know, we view it, you know, in light of what we know now? Because I was just thinking about how, you know, Occupy Ottawa happened, and, you know, there was ostensibly for like left, you know, progressive kind of, you know, means back in, you know, the early 2010s. And then you have the trucker convoy and literally doing the exact same thing, you know, in some ways their demands sort of overlap, but in reality, you know, they're kind of representing different kind of forces. And it would be funny for like an outside, I mean, it would be funny if a like the Onion or something did kind of like a reportage on the trucker protest and to say like freedom, you know, like freedom fighters are like advocating for more democracy.
This is, I mean, not like, I mean, this is pretty cruel, like bitter stuff. But I think Lukashenko, Belarusia's president, or sorry, the Lukashenko in Belarus did something like this with storming of the Capitol in Washington. He's like, oh, you know, they're doing Maidan in Washington D.C. and like, not to at all sympathize with the point that he's probably trying to make, but you can understand how like you can, like, as we just said earlier in the conversation, like particular tactics can be adopted by any people with any types of goals, right? There's no automatic guarantee. There's no automatic link between people in the streets and the progressive forces of history. Good, bad people. Good people can be in the streets. Bad people can be in the streets. People with good intentions, but that will accidentally cause problems, can be in the streets. And yeah, so at the end, I think I just point and say, like, look, my profession needs to do a better job at paying very close attention to what the people actually are asking for and what's going to happen if they win. Like, because this is a question that nobody ever asked. Like, what happens the day after? What happens if this particular group overthrows that particular government in this particular way? Are things likely to get better for the people in this country or worse? And that, like, it seems like a stupidly obvious thing, like almost like ridiculous thing to point out, but we like people in my class forgot about it, including myself in some ways, I think, in the 2010s.
All right. Thanks so much, Vincent, for joining us. The book is If We Burn, The Mass Protest Decade and the Missing Revolution, which will be out October 3rd of this year. By the time you're listening to this, the book will already be out. You can pick it up. It's through Public Affairs publisher. And Vincent, where can people find your work?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter with my handle is VINNCENT. There's a launch page for this book, which also will get you to my personal website if you like. So you just go to www.ifweburn.com, which will have places to buy the book. And if that, you can also find your way from there back to my other work and my social media.